Your home is supposed to be the one place in the world where you feel safe. You lock the door at night and you trust that the walls around you and the people beside you will keep your family protected. The street you live on, the neighbours you wave to, the garden your kids play in, that is your territory. That is where nothing bad is supposed to reach you. But for the victims in these cases, the danger was not across town or hiding in the shadows. It was next door. It was on the other side of the fence. It was the person they passed on the driveway every morning, the face they saw through the kitchen window every evening, the voice they heard through the walls every single night. The threat was close enough to touch, and there was no way to escape it without abandoning their own home. These were not random attacks by strangers. These were calculated acts of violence committed by people who had been living beside their victims for years. Neighbours who watched, who waited, who made promises about what they would do, and who eventually kept those promises, while the systems designed to stop them stood by and did nothing. And the courts made sure they would never terrorise another street again. Today, we are covering neighbours who turned the safest place in the world into a crime scene. What you're about to hear will make you look at the person living next door and wonder whether you ever really know who is on the other side of that wall. Section 1. The Street That Lived in Fear. On the afternoon of October 5th, 2021, Matthew Borman pulled up outside his house on Snowdonia Road in Walton, Cardiff, a small housing development near Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. He was still on a work conference call. His wife Sarah had unlocked the front door and was waiting to greet him. Their 3 children, aged 12, 8 and 3, were inside watching cartoons. Matthew worked as an engineer at GE Aviation. He was 43 years old. He was a father who, according to everyone who knew him, loved every part of the job. Sarah would later describe him as a man who infused fun into the most mundane tasks, who filled their house with music and laughter, who celebrated life at every opportunity. His family called him a kid at heart. His children called him their biggest fan. He never made it from the car to the front door. But to understand what happened to Matthew Borman on that October afternoon, you have to understand what Snowdonia Road had become over the previous 12 years. Because the man who killed Matthew did not appear out of nowhere. He lived next door. His name was Jan Arslan. He was 52 years old, and every single person on that street knew exactly what he was capable of, because he had been telling them for over a decade. Snowdonia Road should have been a good place to raise a family. The sentencing judge, Mrs. Justice Cutts, would later describe it as somewhere that was clearly meant to be a comfortable and welcoming place to live. It was a new build development. The houses were modern. Families with young children lived on the street. Neighbours knew each other. Kids played outside. That was what it was supposed to be. Jan Arslan moved into the street and, over the course of 12 years, turned it into something his neighbours would later describe as a war zone. The harassment started with minor things: parking, a scratch on a car, the kind of small disagreements that happen on every residential street in the country. But with Arslan, nothing stayed small. If someone asked him to park more considerately, he did not say sorry or move his car. He threatened to kill them. If a neighbour raised a polite concern, Arslan responded with racial slurs, death threats, and promises of sexual violence against their wives. Peter Marsden lived on the same street. He told police that Arslan had bullied, abused, and threatened his family for the full 12 years they had been neighbours. It started with minor friction and escalated sharply after 2018, when Arslan accused Marsden's family of scratching his wife's car. After that, Arslan sent multiple abusive emails to Marsden's business email address. He started hanging around the driveway and outside Marsden's back gate, waiting for him to come home from work. He would call Marsden a cocksucker and a motherfucker and tell him he was organising a hitman from the dark web to sort him and his family out. Marsden said Arslan told him he was crazy and had murdered people before and would do it again. Ulysses Alonso, another neighbour, experienced the same thing. He told police his problems with Arslan began when he simply asked the man to park with more consideration. Arslan's response was immediate and extreme. He was racially abusive. He threatened Alonso with his life. He threatened to kill and rape Alonso's wife. Alonso said Arslan's preferred language during any confrontation was a rotation of the same phrases: racial slurs, motherfucker, cocksucker. Every single time. Alonso told police that Arslan had taken photographs of his daughter's bedrooms. He said he was very scared of what Arslan was capable of, and that his family lived in a constant state of anxiety because of the man. For the Bormann family, it was the same nightmare. Matthew had lived next door to Arslan since 2013. Over the years, Arslan had called him Hitler. He called him a cocksucker. He yelled at Sarah that he knew where she and Matthew worked. He filmed the windows of their children's bedrooms. He told Sarah he would murder her and rape her. He told her he would only get 10 years for it, and that 10 years was easy. Sarah's own mother was afraid to visit because she feared Arslan would attack Sarah while she was putting out the washing. That is how deep the fear ran. A grown woman was frightened of being assaulted while hanging laundry in her own back garden, and the Bormanns stopped using their garden entirely. For more than a year before Matthew's death, the family did not go into their back garden because of Arslan's threats. Their children could not play outside in their own home. The abuse had become so severe across the entire street that parents refused to let their kids out in the gardens, and people worried about something as basic as hanging out clothes to dry on a washing line. Arslan had a method that made his threats feel inescapable. He would stand in his back garden and pretend to be on the phone, speaking deliberately loudly so his neighbours could hear every word. The things he said during these fake phone calls were detailed descriptions of the violence he planned to carry out against the people living around him. He spoke about a massacre. He made it clear that his neighbours were meant to hear every single word. It was psychological warfare, conducted from a garden fence, day after day, month after month, year after year. Matthew Bormann gave a statement to the police on May 13, 2021, less than 5 months before his death. He described hearing Arslan in his garden, speaking in a deliberately raised voice about being arrested the previous week. Matthew said Arslan was either speaking to someone on the phone or pretending to be, and the things he said were clearly intended to be overheard. Arslan talked about liking being arrested. He said he was unhinged. He said he missed prison food. He said, God forgives, but he would not forget. He referenced the road rage incident from 2009, where he claimed to have put someone in intensive care. Matthew told police that all of this caused him immense fear and frustration. He said Arslan had been doing this kind of thing for the past 2 years, and that the intention was to intimidate the family into not making complaints to the police. Matthew then said something that would later be read aloud in court. He said he was very scared of what Arslan could do. He did not know what the man was capable of, and he genuinely believed Arslan was trying to intimidate them into silence. This was not a quiet concern held privately between husband and wife. This was a written statement given to the police in which a 43-year-old father of 3 said he was scared for the safety of himself and his family. It was on record. The police had it. Sarah Bormann made her own statement to police around the same time, setting out a detailed summary of the threats the family had received from Arslan. In that statement, she said they were worried about being murdered. She said someone was going to be seriously hurt very soon. She used those words. She did not say they were concerned or anxious. She said they feared being murdered. And it was not just the Bormanns and the Marsdens and the Alonsos who were affected. Mrs. Justice Cutts noted during sentencing that Arslan's behaviour had impacted the entire community of Walton, Cardiff. Detective Inspector Ben Lavender, who worked the case, described how the road used to be a close community where children grew up together. Arslan destroyed that. He caused terror across the neighbourhood for years. The neighbours responded the only way they could. They installed security cameras. Multiple households spent significant amounts of money on CCTV systems, doorbell cameras, and other security upgrades to protect themselves from the man living among them. Peter Marsden installed a system with triple recording locations. The fear was so embedded in daily life that by the time October 2021 arrived, nearly every angle of Snowdonia Road was covered by cameras. That is why so much of what happened on October 5th was captured on video in graphic detail. The residents had been preparing for something terrible to happen. They were recording everything because they knew that one day the evidence might matter. Arslan was not oblivious to what the neighbours were doing. He knew they were gathering evidence. He knew they were making complaints. He knew legal proceedings were being brought against him. And far from making him back down, all of it made him worse. The injunction applications, the police reports, the eviction proceedings. Arslan saw all of it as a personal attack. He blamed his neighbours for trying to get him removed from the street. He brooded on it. He resented it. And he fixated on the people whose names appeared on the legal paperwork. Arslan did have previous convictions on his record. They included battery and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. In 2018, he had been convicted of harassing Peter Marsden. None of it stopped him. None of it changed his behaviour. The pattern only escalated. By the autumn of 2021, Matthew Borman had suffered a breakdown. It had happened at the end of 2020, brought on by the relentless stress of living next door to Arslan. A man who was described by every person who knew him as good, honest, kind, and devoted to his children, had been ground down to the point of collapse by a neighbour who could not be reasoned with, could not be warned, could not be threatened with legal consequences, and could not be stopped by any measure that anyone had tried. Sarah Borman would later describe the experience of living on Snowdonia Road as being trapped in the middle of a war zone. She said they were always on edge about what was going to happen. Not if something was going to happen, when. 12 years of threats. Written statements to the police saying they feared being murdered. A man convicted of harassment and assault who only got worse with every legal measure taken against him. Every single warning sign that a human being can give before they carry out an act of extreme violence, Can Arslan gave. He gave them loudly. He gave them repeatedly. He gave them to anyone who would listen, including the police themselves. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that is exactly what makes the next part of this story so difficult to hear. Because in the months and weeks before Matthew Borman was killed, a series of legal orders were put in place specifically to stop Arslan. Agencies were involved, charges were filed. And on the night of October 4th, 2021, less than 24 hours before the murder, Can Arslan picked up the phone and told a police officer exactly what he was about to do. Section 2. The system that failed. The people on Snowdonia Road did everything they were supposed to do. They called the police, they made statements, they filed complaints, they cooperated with every agency that was supposed to help them. They followed the law. They did not take matters into their own hands. They trusted the system to protect them. And the system let Can Arslan walk right through it. To understand how completely the system failed Matthew Borman and his neighbours, you have to look at what happened in the final months before the murder, because it was not as though nobody was doing anything. On paper, agencies were acting. Legal measures were being taken. Orders were being issued. The problem was that none of it moved fast enough. None of it carried real consequences, and none of it treated Can Arslan like the genuine threat he had been advertising himself as for 12 years. The first formal step came on April 24th, 2021. Arslan was served with a community protection notice. This is a legal order used by local councils to deal with antisocial behaviour. It tells a person to stop doing specific things and warns them there will be consequences if they continue. For someone like Arslan, who had been threatening to rape and kill his neighbours for years, a community protection notice was a piece of paper. It changed nothing about his behaviour. He carried on exactly as before. The next step came from Tewkesbury Borough Council. The council applied to the court for a civil injunction against Arslan. This injunction would forbid him from using or threatening violence against his neighbours. It was a stronger measure than the community protection notice. It was issued on June 22nd, 2021. The problem was that Arslan had to be personally served with the injunction for it to take effect. And because he had been away, the injunction was not served on him until September 23rd, 2021. That was 12 days before he murdered Matthew Borman. 12 days. The legal system had spent months processing the paperwork for an injunction designed to stop a man who had been threatening violence for years, and it landed in his hands less than 2 weeks before he carried out the ultimate act of violence. And even when it was served, the injunction only told Arslan to stop threatening and abusing his neighbours. It did not remove him from the street. It did not restrict his movement. It did not put any physical barrier between him and the people he had been terrorising. Several of the neighbours had given statements to support the injunction application. Matthew Borman gave one, Sarah Borman gave one, Ulysses Alonso gave one, Peter Marsden gave one. These were the people who were trying to do things properly, working within the legal framework, putting their names on official documents to get this man stopped. And in doing so, they put a target on themselves, because Arslan saw the injunction as a personal attack. He knew exactly whose names were on that paperwork, and during his police interview after the murder, he told investigators that he had intended to kill all the people named in the injunction. He said it again later in the same interview to make sure they understood. Mrs. Justice Cutts noted this during sentencing. She pointed out that the victims in this case were the very people who had been following lawful processes to try and resolve a long-standing problem. They were punished for doing the right thing. On September 28, 2021, exactly 1 week before the murder, Arslan was formally charged with harassment of Mr. and Mrs. Bormann and Ulysses Alonso. He was released on bail. His bail conditions stated he was not to have any direct or indirect contact with the Bormann household. 1 week later, he stabbed Matthew Bormann 27 times on his own front lawn. He was on bail for harassing Matthew at the time he killed him. At the same time as the harassment charge and the injunction, Arslan had also been told by his landlord that he was going to be evicted. The eviction was a direct result of his own behaviour over the years. But Arslan did not see it that way. He brooded on it. Mrs. Justice Cutts said in her sentencing remarks that Arslan had brought the eviction entirely upon himself, but he resented it deeply. He blamed his neighbours. He saw the injunction, the harassment charge, and the eviction as a coordinated attack against him by the people around him. All of this was closing in on Arslan at once during September 2021. He had been charged with a criminal offence, he was under a civil injunction, he was facing eviction. And rather than being managed as a ticking bomb by the agencies involved, he was left in the same house, on the same street, next door to the people he had been threatening to kill for years. Then came the phone call. On the evening of October 4th, 2021, a police officer telephoned Jan Arslan. The call was about counter-allegations Arslan himself had made against Matthew Bormann. Arslan had accused the Bormanns and other neighbours of racially abusing him. The police were following up on his complaint. During the call, Arslan verbally abused the officer. He called the officer a motherfucker. He called him a cocksucker. And then he told the officer he would sort his neighbour out himself. He said, directly and clearly, that he would murder him. The officer, according to the sentencing remarks of Mrs. Justice Cutts, took Arslan to mean Matthew Bormann. That was the evening of October 4th. Matthew Bormann was murdered the following afternoon. Less than 24 hours passed between Jan Arslan telling a police officer he was going to murder his neighbour and Jan Arslan murdering his neighbour. The judge stated that it was plain from what happened next that this had been Arslan's settled intention. What happened in those 24 hours? What action did Gloucestershire police take after receiving a direct, explicit murder threat against a named individual from a man who was already on bail for harassing that same individual, who was already subject to a civil injunction for threatening violence, who was already facing eviction, and who had a documented 12-year history of escalating threats against the entire neighbourhood? The answer, based on everything presented at trial and in the subsequent investigations, is that no effective intervention took place. Matthew Bormann went to work the next morning. He came home that afternoon. He pulled up to his house on a conference call. And Arslan was waiting for him with a knife. After the murder, Gloucestershire Constabulary made a mandatory referral to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. The IOPC is the body that investigates police forces in England and Wales when serious failures are alleged. The referral was made straight after Matthew Bormann's death, which tells you that Gloucestershire Police already knew their handling of the situation was going to face scrutiny. The IOPC opened an independent investigation. They said they were examining what actions police took in response to a number of reports made by neighbours since January of the previous year. That investigation would later result in a misconduct notice being served on one police constable in relation to their contact with Arslan. The IOPC was clear that a misconduct notice means an officer is told their conduct is under investigation. It does not automatically mean disciplinary proceedings will follow, but the fact that it was served at all confirmed that the police response to Arslan was being formally questioned. After Arslan was convicted of murder in April 2022, the Bormann family spoke publicly for the first time about the system that had failed Matthew. His sister, Sarah Elston, said the murder had shocked the family to the core, but was not remotely out of the blue. She said that in the years before Matthew's death, multiple agencies and authorities had been warned about the threat Arslan posed, not just to Matthew, but to many other neighbours. She said the police and other authorities had been told how dangerous Arslan was, the threats he had made, and the risks he presented. She described the police response as toothless and ineffective. And she added one detail that captured the sheer absurdity of the failure. The response had been toothless and ineffective, she said, even when the defendant himself told the police he was going to murder Matthew. Sarah Borman echoed this. She said that on October 5th, Matthew's life was stolen, and the family would never be the same. She said they intended to fight in Matthew's name to expose not only the cruelty of the man who killed him, but also the failings in the system that allowed it to happen. Gloucestershire Constabulary eventually acknowledged one specific area where they believed they could have done things differently. Assistant Chief Constable Craig Holden released a statement after the sentencing in which he said the force should have viewed Arslan's behaviour and actions as stalking. He explained that traditionally, cases like Arslan's were handled by neighbourhood policing teams as protracted neighbour disputes or long-term antisocial behaviour. They were not looked at through the lens of stalking. This distinction matters enormously. If Arslan's escalating behaviour had been classified as stalking rather than a neighbourhood dispute, he could have been referred to the county's stalking clinic. This is a specialist panel where offenders' behaviour is assessed and the risk they pose is evaluated. The clinic can It is a far more serious intervention than a community protection notice or a civil injunction. But none of that happened. For 12 years, Arslan's behaviour was filed under antisocial behaviour and neighbour disputes. It was treated as a nuisance problem, not a safety problem. And the man at the centre of it kept escalating because nothing that was thrown at him came with real teeth. Following the case, Gloucestershire Constabulary said they had delivered tailored training to all their neighbourhood teams and built it into training for new recruits, specifically around identifying stalking behaviour in cases that present as neighbour disputes. They also said they were training specialist officers across the force to increase expertise on stalking beyond the situations it is traditionally associated with, such as domestic abuse or romantic fixation. A broader independent multi-agency review was also commissioned to look at how public and private sector organisations had worked together to address the concerns of Arslan's neighbours. The goal was to identify every possible learning opportunity from what went wrong. None of that brought Matthew Borman home. The system had every piece of information it needed. Written statements from multiple victims saying they feared being murdered. A criminal charge for harassment already filed. A civil injunction already in place. A documented history of threats, abuse, and prior convictions stretching back more than a decade. A man who refused every form of help offered to him over the years, including anger management referrals and mental health support. And finally, a direct statement to a police officer, spoken out loud on a recorded call, that he was going to murder the man living next door to him. Every warning was given. Every process was followed by the victims. Every signal was there. And on October 5th, 2021, at around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, while children watched cartoons inside the house and dinner was being prepared up and down the street, Jan Arslan walked across the short distance between his property and Matthew Borman's front lawn, carrying a knife he had ready, and did exactly what he had promised to do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened in the next few minutes was captured from multiple angles by the cameras his terrified neighbours had installed. And what those cameras recorded was something a prosecutor would later describe as a horror movie. Except this one was real. It happened in broad daylight, and the whole street was forced to watch. Section 3. October 5th, 2021. October 5th, 2021 was a bright and sunny day. Mrs. Justice Cutts opened the crime portion of her sentencing remarks with that detail. In the late afternoon, families on Snowdonia Road were going about their ordinary lives. Children were playing in the street. Dinner was being cooked. The judge said all was at peace. Matthew Borman was driving home from work at GE Aviation. He was on a conference call with colleagues, connected through his mobile phone. It was something he did regularly. He pulled up in front of his house the same way he always did. Sarah Borman was inside with their 3 children. She had unlocked the front door and was ready to greet him. She could see out through the kitchen window. That was when she saw Chan Arslan cross in front of the window. Arslan had been waiting. The prosecution established during the trial that he had laid in wait specifically to ambush Matthew as he returned home. He had a knife ready. He knew Matthew's routine. He knew when he came home from work. And he had told a police officer less than 24 hours earlier exactly what he planned to do. Matthew did not make the short distance from his car to his front door. Arslan attacked him before he got there. Matthew's colleagues were still connected to the conference call. They heard him shout. One of them later told investigators it was like listening to a totally horrendous horror movie. Prosecutor Kate Brunner, QC, used that description in court. She said it was a horror movie that was just beginning, and Arslan had written the script. Arslan stabbed Matthew on his front lawn. He took him completely by surprise. Matthew had no chance to defend himself. A post-mortem examination would later find 27 serious knife injuries to his face, neck and back, along with many more superficial cuts. The judge noted in her sentencing remarks that Arslan did not stop even after Matthew fell forward. He sat on Matthew's prone body and continued to stab him. One neighbour who witnessed the attack said Arslan was not acting in a frenzy. He was calm. He was controlled. He positioned the knife on each occasion before driving it into Matthew. Sarah Borman saw everything. She ran out of the house to save her husband. She tried to drag Arslan off Matthew's body. As she pulled at him, Arslan swiped at her with the knife and stabbed her in the thigh. It was a deep wound. He told her to go. All of his attention was on her husband. In her police interview, Sarah described the way Arslan brought the blade down over and over again into Matthew's face and neck. She mimed the motion for the officers recording her statement. She said he stabbed Matthew like he was an animal. Sarah screamed at the neighbours to come and help. Arslan swiped at her again. And then she had to make a decision that no parent should ever have to make. She had to leave her husband on the ground and go back inside the house because she was terrified that if Arslan turned on her too, their 3 children would lose both their parents in the same afternoon. She went back through the front door to be with her kids. Those children heard everything. All 3 of them, 12, 8, and 3 years old, heard their parents screaming outside. The 12-year-old saw what Arslan was doing. He saw his father being stabbed on the front lawn. The boy ran to the lounge and shut his younger siblings inside to try and protect them from what was happening. He was 12. Mrs. Justice Cutts said the impact on those children, in addition to losing their father, had been deeply traumatic. She said it was beyond anything children of that age should ever have to witness. Outside, Arslan finally stopped stabbing Matthew. He sat on Matthew's body, and he lit a cigarette. Sarah described it as triumphant. She said Arslan sat on top of her husband as he lay dying and smoked like a man who had just accomplished something he was proud of. Then he threw the cigarette on the ground, got up casually and walked around to the front garden as Matthew lay on the floor. But Arslan was not finished. Matthew Borman was not the only name on his list. He walked away from the Bormans' property and headed toward the home of Peter Marsden, the neighbour who had given a statement in support of the injunction against him. An off-duty police officer named Stephen Wilkinson had heard the commotion and come outside. He had no weapon. He grabbed a plank of wood. Bodycam footage and CCTV captured him following Arslan toward the rear entrance of Marsden's property, carrying the piece of wood and trying to intervene. Arslan forced the gate to Marsden's back garden open and entered the kitchen, where Peter Marsden was sitting with his wife cooking dinner. Marsden did not know Arslan was carrying a knife. He tried to force Arslan out of the house. During the struggle, Arslan stabbed Marsden 8 times. 6 of the wounds were to his abdomen, 2 were to his shoulder. The bleeding was extensive. Marsden would later spend time in hospital in a critical but stable condition and had to take 4 months off work to recover. As Marsden fought to push Arslan out of his kitchen, Sergeant Wilkinson entered the garden and swung the plank of wood at Arslan, hitting him and allowing Marsden to get back inside and lock the door. Mrs. Justice Cutts said in her sentencing remarks that she believed Wilkinson saved Peter Marsden's life with that intervention. Arslan had already admitted in his guilty plea that he intended to kill Marsden. Without Wilkinson stepping in armed with nothing but a piece of timber, Marsden would very likely have died in his own kitchen. Arslan left the Marsden property and walked back out toward the street. He still had the knife. He was heading in the direction of the Alonso household. As he passed Ulysses Alonso, he looked at him and said 2 words. "You're next." By now, the street had mobilised. Another off-duty police officer, PC Josh Norris, had collected 2 golf clubs. Several neighbours had come outside with whatever they could find: golf clubs, bats, planks of wood. A group of around 6 or 7 men surrounded Arslan in the street. For the next 18 minutes, they contained him. They kept him at bay while armed with nothing more than sporting equipment and garden materials. Arslan still had the knife. He was threatening to kill everyone around him. He lunged at people. He told them to be afraid. He was enjoying the attention. Sarah Borman said he loved it. During those same 18 minutes, while the men held Arslan in the street, a separate group of neighbours was on the front lawn trying to save Matthew Borman's life. 2 of them were off-duty nurses, including a woman named Elizabeth Stock. They performed CPR. They did everything they could. At one point, Arslan started walking back toward the Borman's house, and the people working on Matthew had to physically carry him away from the lawn in case Arslan tried to attack him again. They carried him inside the house to get him away from the man who had just stabbed him 27 times. Matthew Borman was treated at the scene by paramedics when they arrived. He was declared dead a short time later. Sarah would later say in her victim impact statement that Matt did not die in the front garden where he was attacked. He died in their house, away from the evil man and with love around him. Police arrived on the scene with tasers. Arslan was red-dotted with a laser sight. He finally dropped the knife. He was arrested and handcuffed on the ground. And then the body cam footage captured something that would be played to the jury during his trial. Lying on the road with his hands cuffed behind his back, Jan Arslan started laughing. He looked at the officers and said, "He's dead, isn't he?" He said, "I warned you, the police. 1 year. Look, it's happened." He said, "I was special forces. I warned them I was going to murder him." And then he laughed again. He told the officers he had warned the police for a year because his neighbour was against his son and his wife. He said there was a bounty on the police officers. He called them motherfuckers. He said, "You're next," to the officers who had just arrested him. And in between the threats and the boasting, he complained that his handcuffs were too tight and blamed his arthritis. Neighbour Elizabeth Stock, the off-duty nurse who had been trying to save Matthew's life, noticed something else when the police arrived. Arslan's wife, Louise, was verbally aggressive toward the officers. She threw a glass of water at them, while her husband was being arrested for stabbing 3 people and killing one of them. While a man lay dead in the house next door, Louise Arslan's reaction was hostility toward the police. Kate Brunner QC described Arslan's demeanour throughout the entire attack in one line during the trial. She said the defendant appeared calm, smiling, as if he was amused by what he was doing, and Sarah Borman confirmed it from what she had witnessed. She said he was calm, he knew exactly what he was doing, he had waited for Matthew, he had done what he wanted to do, and he was pleased with himself. The entire event, from the first stab on the front lawn to the arrest in the street, was captured from multiple angles on the CCTV cameras and doorbell cameras that the neighbours had installed because they were so afraid of the man living among them. The footage was played to the jury. It showed Arslan crossing the street with purpose. It showed the attack. It showed him walking to Marsden's house. It showed Wilkinson following him with the plank of wood. It showed the neighbours forming a group to contain him. All of it was recorded because the people on Snowdonia Road had spent years preparing for the day that Jan Arslan finally did what he had always said he would do. After his arrest, Arslan was taken to hospital. He claimed to have taken an overdose, but medical staff found no evidence of any drugs in his system. A psychiatric assessment found that he was alert and showed no psychotic symptoms. He was fully aware of where he was and what he had done. While at the hospital, he made comments to police about stabbing his neighbours. He referenced his eviction. He said his life had been ruined. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And then, at 7:33 p.m. on the evening of October 5th, 2021, several hours after the murder, Jan Arslan mentioned for the first time in his life that he heard voices telling him to kill. He said it was the voice of his childhood teddy bear. It was the first time he had ever mentioned hearing voices to anyone. Any doctor, any officer, any medical professional, at any point in his 52 years of life. That claim would become the foundation of his entire defence strategy at trial, and 2 forensic psychiatrists would be called to examine whether there was any truth to it at all. Section 4. The teddy bear defence can. Arslan was charged with the murder of Matthew Borman, the attempted murder of Peter Marsden, causing grievous bodily harm with intent to Sarah Borman and a Frey. He was remanded in custody and later transferred to Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital, where he remained until his sentencing. When the case came to Bristol Crown Court in late March 2022, Arslan did not deny killing Matthew Borman. He could not deny it. The entire attack had been captured on multiple CCTV and doorbell cameras. His colleagues had heard it happen over the phone. Dozens of neighbours had witnessed it. He had laughed about it on body cam footage while being arrested. There was no version of events where Can Arslan did not kill Matthew Borman, and he knew it. So his defence took a different path. Arslan pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Matthew Borman, but denied murder. He admitted the attempted murder of Peter Marsden. He admitted causing grievous bodily harm with intent to Sarah Borman. He admitted a Frey. But on the central charge, the killing of Matthew Borman, he said it was not murder. He said it was manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Diminished responsibility is a legal defence that exists in English law under the Homicide Act. In simple terms, it means the person who committed the killing was suffering from an abnormality of mental functioning at the time of the act, and that this abnormality substantially impaired their ability to understand what they were doing, to form a rational judgment, or to exercise self-control. If the defence is accepted, a murder charge is reduced to manslaughter, which carries a significantly lower sentence. Murder carries a mandatory life sentence. Manslaughter does not. The question for the jury was straightforward. Was Can Arslan in the grip of a mental condition that substantially impaired his responsibility for what he did on October 5, 2021? Or did he know exactly what he was doing, plan it in advance, carry it out with full awareness, and then try to fake a mental illness after the fact to avoid the consequences? The foundation of Arslan's defence was the claim he had made at 7:33 p.m. on the evening of the murder, several hours after the killing, while being assessed at the hospital. He told medical staff that he had heard voices telling him to kill. Specifically, he said it was the voice of his childhood teddy bear. This was the first time in Arslan's entire life that he had ever mentioned hearing voices to anyone. Not to a doctor, not to a therapist, not to a police officer. Not during any of his previous arrests, not during any of the mental health referrals that had been offered to him over the years and that he had refused. There was no record anywhere of Can Arslan ever claiming to hear voices before the night he murdered his neighbour. The claim appeared for the first time at 7:33 p.m, after the killing, after the arrest, after the body cam footage in which he laughed and boasted about what he had done. 2 forensic psychiatrists examined Arslan and gave evidence at trial. Both of them confirmed the same thing. Can Arslan was not psychotic. He was not mentally ill. He did not have schizophrenia. He was not suffering from any condition that would cause auditory hallucinations. What he did have was a personality disorder. The diagnosis was specific. Arslan had a personality disorder comprised of 3 distinct types: paranoid, emotionally unstable, and antisocial. This is a recognised medical condition. It meant that Arslan's personality sat outside what is considered normal. It manifested in extreme anger and aggression in response to perceived insults, in making grandiose claims about himself, and in an exaggerated sense of his own importance. Anyone who had lived near him for the past 12 years could have told the court that without needing a psychiatrist. But a personality disorder is not the same thing as a mental illness, and this distinction was at the heart of the trial. The defence argued that Arslan's personality disorder was itself an abnormality of mental functioning, and that it therefore provided a defence to murder. They said his condition impaired his responsibility for what he did. This was the legal argument that Mr. Godfrey QC, defending, put before the jury. The prosecution argued the opposite. Kate Brunner QC told the jury that despite having a personality that lay outside what is considered normal, Arslan was fully in control of himself throughout the attack. He knew the difference between right and wrong. He had planned the attack. He had laid in wait. He had told a police officer the night before that he was going to murder Matthew Borman. And then he did exactly that. The prosecution said this was a premeditated killing carried out in retribution and anger, not the actions of a man who had lost control of his mind. The prosecution's expert witness was Dr. John Sanford, a forensic psychiatrist. Dr. Sanford's testimony was critical. He told the jury that he was skeptical of Arslan's claim about hearing voices. He explained that people suffering from a genuine psychotic episode or prolonged mental illness tend to have what he called a package of symptoms. This package typically includes paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, and visual hallucinations occurring together as part of a broader psychiatric condition. When you get a voice on its own, Sanford told the jury, you are always very skeptical. But when you get a voice on its own after a serious offence, you are even more skeptical. Arslan had no package of symptoms. He had no history of psychosis. He had no history of hearing voices. He had no visual hallucinations. He had nothing except a single claim made hours after the murder that a teddy bear had spoken to him. And the first medical professionals who assessed him at the hospital on the night of the killing found that he was alert and had no psychotic symptoms at all. Dr. Sanford accepted that Arslan had a personality disorder. That was not in dispute, but he told the jury that despite his impaired personality, Arslan had acted rationally and in a controlled way throughout the entire incident on October 5th. He understood the consequences of his actions. He knew what he was doing when he picked up the knife. He knew what he was doing when he waited for Matthew to come home. He knew what he was doing when he stabbed him 27 times on the front lawn, sat on his body, lit a cigarette, and then walked to the next house on his list. This was consistent with everything the witnesses had described. Neighbour after neighbour had told police that Arslan was calm during the attack. He was not in a frenzy. He was not screaming or ranting. He positioned the knife before each stab. He told Sarah Borman to go away so he could focus on her husband. He walked to Peter Marsden's house with purpose and forced the gate open. He told Ulysses Alonso he was next. He threatened the group of men who surrounded him in the street for 18 minutes. And when police arrived and he was put in handcuffs, he laughed and said he had warned them. None of that is what a psychotic episode looks like. Every single action Arslan took that afternoon was deliberate, sequential, and targeted at specific people for specific reasons that he had articulated to police and neighbours for years. Mrs. Justice Cutts addressed this directly in her sentencing remarks. She noted that after his arrest, Arslan faked amnesia and mental illness to seek to avoid the consequences of his actions. The judge did not use softer language. She did not say he appeared to experience amnesia or he may have been confused. She said he faked it. There was another detail that further undermined Arslan's defence. Over the years, multiple agencies had tried to help him manage his behaviour. Mental health professionals had offered him referrals. He had been referred to a mental health team for anger management. He had been offered therapy. He had been prescribed medication. He refused all of it. Every single time he refused to engage. He would not take the medication. He would not attend the anger management sessions. He would not participate in therapy. Mrs. Justice Cutts noted this in sentencing. She said that if his personality disorder did lower his degree of culpability, it did so only to a negligible extent, and she specifically highlighted his repeated refusal to accept any of the help that had been offered to him. The prosecution also presented something else to the jury during the trial. In the months between his arrest and his court date, Arslan had been examined by psychiatrists as part of the legal process. During those assessments, he did not express remorse. He did not say he wished he had not done it. He told the psychiatrists that Matthew Borman deserved to die. And it did not stop there. From his prison cell, while awaiting trial for murder, Arslan continued to threaten his former neighbours on Snowdonia Road. The people who had survived his rampage, who were trying to recover from what they had witnessed, who were raising children traumatised by watching their neighbour kill their father, were still receiving threats from the man behind bars. The judge confirmed this during sentencing. She said Arslan had shown no guilt or remorse at any stage about Matthew Borman's death, and had continued to utter threats to his neighbours from prison. She called him, without doubt, a highly dangerous man. The trial lasted approximately a week and a half. The jury heard the CCTV footage. They heard the body cam footage of the arrest, including Arslan laughing and boasting. They heard Sarah Borman's recorded police interview, in which she mimed the stabbing motion and described her husband being treated like a piece of meat. They heard the testimony of the forensic psychiatrists. They heard the 12-year history of threats and abuse. They heard about the phone call the night before, in which Arslan told police he would murder Matthew Borman. They heard that Arslan told investigators he had intended to kill all the people named in the injunction. The jury rejected the defence of diminished responsibility. On April 5, 2022, Can Arslan was found unanimously guilty of murder. He sat impassively in the dock as the foreman delivered the verdict. He showed nothing. No reaction. No emotion. The same blank stillness he had shown throughout the trial. Mrs. Justice Cutts did not sentence him that day. She told Arslan she wanted a further psychiatric report prepared before she would determine the minimum term. She told him he would be sentenced on June 9th. He was taken back to custody to wait. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The conviction meant Arslan faced a mandatory life sentence. The only question left was how long he would have to serve before he could even be considered for parole. And the answer, when it came 2 months later, would reflect not just the murder of Matthew Borman, but the full scope of what Can Arslan had done to an entire community over 12 years, and the total absence of remorse he showed for any of it. Section 5. 38 years. On June 9th, 2022, 8 months after he murdered Matthew Borman, Can Arslan was brought back to Bristol Crown Court for sentencing. Mrs. Justice Cutts had requested additional psychiatric reports before determining the minimum term. Those reports were now complete. The courtroom was full. Sarah Borman was there. Matthew's mother was there. His siblings were there. Peter Marsden, the man Arslan had stabbed 8 times and nearly killed, was there. The families who had lived through 12 years of terror on Snowdonia Road and then watched their neighbour be killed on his front lawn were there to hear what the legal system would do with the man who had destroyed their community. Before the judge spoke, the court heard victim impact statements. These are the moments in a criminal trial where the human cost of what happened is spoken out loud, not by lawyers or police officers, but by the people who have to live with it every day for the rest of their lives. Sarah Borman's statement was read to the court. She described Matthew as a good, honest and kind man who never fell out with anybody. She called him a fantastic father who was fully engaged with his children and would do anything for them. She said he enjoyed all parts of parenting. She said their children knew nothing but love and care and kindness from him. She described him as her soulmate. And then she described what life had become without him. She told the court that every day she woke up, her heart shattered some more. She talked about their 3 children, who at the time of the murder had been 12, 8 and 3 years old. The eldest had seen what Arslan did to his father through the window. He had run to the lounge and shut his younger brother and sister inside to protect them. All 3 children required ongoing therapy. Sarah said she struggled to explain to Matt's biggest fans, his children, what had happened. She said they did not understand why a bad man would want to hurt their daddy so much that they could never see him again. She described the years of living next to Arslan as being in the middle of a war zone, always on edge, always waiting for something to happen. And she made clear that while the murder itself lasted only minutes, the destruction Arslan had caused stretched across years before it and would stretch across the rest of their lives after it. Sarah also thanked the people who had tried to save her husband. She said many of them were strangers she had never met before. She did not know their names. She did not know if they had families waiting for them at home, but they came to help her and tried to save Matt by selflessly running toward danger. She called them heroes. She said these strangers, with kindness and love, came to her rescue. She ended with one detail that she wanted on the record. Matthew did not die on the front garden where he was attacked. He died inside their house, away from the evil man, and with love around him. The neighbours who had been performing CPR on the lawn had carried him inside when Arslan started walking back in their direction. Matthew Borman took his last breath in his own home, surrounded by people who were trying to save him. He was 43 years old. Matthew's mother had also provided a statement. The judge noted that Matthew had been a support and a mainstay of his mother throughout his entire life, but particularly since June 2021, when his father had died. Matthew's mother lost her husband and then, 4 months later, lost her son to a man who lived next door. Every member of Matthew's family, the judge said, had suffered considerably since his death. They mourned not only his loss, but also felt substantially less safe in their own homes. Matthew's sister, Sarah Elston, had spoken publicly after the conviction in April and repeated her position at sentencing. She said the family would never be the same, but that they would fight in Matthew's name to expose the failings that had allowed this to happen. She called the police response toothless and ineffective. She said the murder had shocked them to the core, but was not remotely out of the blue. Agencies had been warned. Police had been told. Arslan himself had told them. And Matthew was dead anyway. Mrs. Justice Cutts then delivered her sentencing remarks. They were detailed, they were precise, and they were as close to controlled fury as a High Court judge can express from the bench. She began by setting the scene. She described Snowdonia Road as a place that should have been comfortable and welcoming. She said Arslan had been fortunate to live there, and then she laid out what he had done to it. She said he had mounted a campaign of harassment and abuse of the most extreme nature. She said he had threatened to rape and to kill. She said he had spoken of a massacre. She said he had caused very real fear to those he treated this way. She noted that his neighbours had gone to considerable expense to install security systems. She said they had felt unable to use their gardens and felt highly anxious in and around their homes, the very places in which they should and were entitled to feel safe. The judge listed the legal measures that had been in place against Arslan at the time of the murder. The Community Protection Notice served on April 24, 2021. The council injunction, issued on June 22, 2021, and served on Arslan on September 23, 12 days before the killing. The harassment charge filed on September 28, 1 week before the murder, for which Arslan was on bail. And the eviction notice from his landlord. She said Arslan had brought the eviction entirely upon himself, but brooded and resented it. She addressed the phone call on the evening of October 4th. She said Arslan had told the police officer he would murder Matthew Borman. She said the officer took him to mean Mr. Borman, and she said it was plain from what happened next that this had been Arslan's settled intention. The judge then turned to the legal framework for sentencing. Under Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020, the most serious murders carry a starting point of a whole life order, meaning the offender will never be released. Mrs. Justice Cutts said she had carefully considered whether this case fell into that category. She concluded that while it was a case of the utmost seriousness, it more appropriately fell into the next tier, where the seriousness of the murder, combined with the associated offences, was particularly high in terms of both culpability and harm. This meant the starting point for the minimum term was 30 years. She then listed the aggravating factors that would push the sentence upward from that starting point. On culpability, the judge found that the attack was targeted and planned, carried out in revenge against people who had been following lawful processes to resolve problems Arslan had created. He had laid in wait to ambush Matthew when he was completely defenceless. The attack was particularly brutal. It took place in broad daylight, in a residential area, in front of members of the public. He persisted despite pleas from people begging him to stop, and despite physical attempts to disarm him. He knew children were inside the house, close to where their father was being killed, and he would have expected them to hear it. He threatened Stephen Wilkinson and others in the street with the knife after killing Matthew. He attacked Peter Marsden in his own home with the intent to kill him, and was only prevented from doing so by Wilkinson's intervention. And after all of this, he faked amnesia and mental illness to try and avoid the consequences. On harm, the judge found that Arslan had taken the life of a man he had already caused significant anxiety and stress for many years. It was clear from the evidence that Matthew knew he was being killed and must have been absolutely terrified. Arslan caused very significant physical injury to Peter Marsden and seriously wounded Sarah Borman. He caused significant psychological harm to Sarah and to her 3 children, all of whom required ongoing therapy. Members of Matthew's wider family had been seriously affected, with some experiencing ongoing mental health issues. That harm had been compounded by Arslan's continuing threats from prison. He caused terror to those who witnessed his behaviour, and the impact on the community had been long-lasting. Additional aggravating factors included the fact that Arslan was on bail for the harassment of Sarah Borman at the time of the offences, that he was subject to court orders, and that he had previous convictions including battery, assault occasioning, actual bodily harm, and a harassment conviction relating to Peter Marsden in 2018. Then the judge said something that landed like a hammer. She said she found no mitigation in his case. None. She acknowledged that Arslan suffered from a personality disorder comprised of 3 types: paranoid, emotionally unstable, and antisocial, and that this was a recognised medical condition. But the jury had found it did not diminish his responsibility. She accepted the evidence of Dr. Sanford that while Arslan's personality was impaired, he had acted rationally and in a controlled way throughout the attack, and understood the consequences of his actions. She said that if his personality disorder did lower his degree of culpability, it did so only to a negligible extent. And she pointed out that he had repeatedly refused every form of professional help that had been offered to him over the years, including medication, mental health referrals, anger management, and therapy. She addressed Arslan directly. She told him he had shown no guilt or remorse at any stage about Matthew Borman's death. She said he had told the psychiatrists who examined him before the trial that Matthew deserved to die. She said he had continued to threaten his neighbours from prison. She called him, without doubt, a highly dangerous man. The sentence was life imprisonment with a minimum term of 38 years, less the 248 days he had already served on remand. That meant Arslan would be in his late 80s before the parole board could even consider whether he should be released. And even then, release would not be automatic. The parole board would have to determine that he was no longer a danger. If he was ever released, he would remain on licence for the rest of his life. If that licence was revoked for any reason, he would be recalled to prison. On top of the life sentence for murder, Mrs. Justice Cutts imposed concurrent sentences for the other offences. 20 years for the attempted murder of Peter Marsden, 6 years for wounding Sarah Borman with intent, 16 months for a fray. These ran alongside the life sentence rather than on top of it, but the judge made clear she had factored them into the overall minimum term. She told Arslan that on that afternoon, for no reason at all, he had taken the life of a decent family man. He had robbed his children of their father, his wife of her husband, and his mother and siblings of a much-loved son and brother. She said no punishment could bring Matthew back. Those who loved and cherished him had to live forever with his loss. The judge also addressed the impact on the wider community. She referenced Detective Inspector Lavender's description of how Snowdonia Road used to be a close community where children grew up together. Arslan had destroyed that. The prospect of his eviction had brought hope to many of the residents. Since Matthew's death, the community had remained in fear because Arslan had continued making threats from his prison cell. Many residents could not forget the events of that day. It would take time, the judge said, for them to feel at home again. After sentencing, the institutional response continued. The IOPC confirmed that its investigation into Gloucestershire Police was ongoing. By the time of sentencing, the watchdog had served a misconduct notice on one police constable in relation to their contact with Arslan. The IOPC stated that the investigation had begun in November 2021, immediately after Gloucestershire Constabulary made a mandatory referral following Matthew's death. The scope of the investigation covered police actions in response to reports made by neighbours since January 2020. An independent, multi-agency partnership review was also commissioned by senior representatives from local agencies. This review was broader than the IOPC investigation. It looked at how public and private sector organisations had worked together, or failed to work together, to address the concerns raised by Arslan's neighbours over the years. The review was non-statutory, meaning it was intended to identify lessons and improve future practice rather than assign legal blame. Gloucestershire Constabulary issued its own response through Assistant Chief Constable Craig Holden. He acknowledged one critical failing. The force admitted that it should have viewed Arslan's behaviour as stalking rather than treating it as a long-running neighbour dispute. Holden explained that traditionally, cases like Arslan's were handled by neighbourhood policing teams as antisocial behaviour issues. They were not assessed through a stalking framework, but if they had been, Arslan could have been referred to the county's stalking clinic, where offenders are discussed by a specialist panel and the risk they pose is properly evaluated. That process can lead to protective orders with real requirements attached, not just instructions to stop behaving badly, but enforceable mandates to take positive action, including treatment and monitoring. Nothing like that was ever applied to Can Arslan. Holden said the force had since delivered tailored training to all neighbourhood policing teams and built stalking awareness into the training programme for new recruits. Additional officers across the constabulary were also being trained as stalking specialists to ensure the behaviour was identified in all contexts, not just the ones traditionally associated with it, such as domestic abuse or romantic fixation. Tewkesbury Borough Council also responded. A spokesman said the council's powers to evict people from private housing were extremely limited. This was the reality that had delayed Arslan's removal from the street for years. He was a tenant in a privately rented property, and the legal process required to evict a private tenant in England is slow and heavily weighted toward the tenant's rights, even when that tenant is terrorising an entire neighbourhood. D.I. Ben Lavender, the detective who led the investigation, said after sentencing that Arslan continued to show not a single shred of remorse and deserved to spend a significant amount of time behind bars. He said what happened in October 2021 was truly horrific, witnessed by several people in the community who were still recovering. He praised the bravery of the neighbours who had intervened, saying, without them, other lives would very likely have been taken that evening. Can Arslan is currently serving his life sentence. He will not be eligible to be considered for parole until he is approximately 90 years old. He has shown no remorse. He has continued to threaten people from behind bars. The judge who sentenced him said there was no mitigation in his case. Nothing in his background, nothing in his mental health, nothing in his personality disorder that justified or excused what he did. Matthew Borman was 43 years old. He was an engineer. He was a husband. He was a father of 3 children who are now growing up without him. His wife Sarah has to explain to those children over and over as they get older and understand more why a bad man hurt their daddy so much that he can never come home. The eldest child, who was 12 at the time, saw his father being stabbed to death through the window of their house and then ran to protect his younger siblings. He will carry that for the rest of his life. Snowdonia Road is still there. The houses are still modern. The street still looks like a place where families should feel safe. But the people who lived through those 12 years and that October afternoon know what it actually became. They installed cameras because the system would not protect them. They gave statements because they were told that was the right thing to do. They followed every legal process available to them. And the man who told police he was going to murder their neighbour was left on their street, next door to his target, with a knife and 24 hours of uninterrupted access to carry out exactly what he promised. 4 lives were permanently shattered on that front lawn. Matthew lost his life. Sarah lost her husband. 3 children lost their father. And an entire community lost the one thing that every person is entitled to feel on the street where they live: that they are safe. While Can Arslan destroyed his neighbourhood over 12 years before finally killing the man next door, the next case involves a different kind of danger, one that did not come with 12 years of warning signs and a community that never saw the violence coming until it was already too late. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.